Just a reminder, if you missed it on Twitter, for the first 500 YouTube subscribers, one lucky winner will be randomly chosen to win an Amazon Fire tablet so you can watch Ajon P's lessons on the go. In this lesson, we're going to cover Angular Materials dynamic navigation from Firestore using the material tree and material expansion panel. This is one of the longest lessons I've recorded so far, and there's a lot involved in it between Firestore, navigation, the material tree, and the expansion panel. So if you're like AJ and you're almost asleep, you might want to hit pause on this one and come back to it. But otherwise, here we go. Because we're going to start using Firestore as a backend, we need to add a new Firebase project. And inside of that project, we need to select database, and then it should prompt you immediately for the Firestore. If not, there should be a toggle to select. You can then create a database, and we're going to do it in the locked mode. And I'll explain that as the video goes. You'll see the failures and how to adjust to those. I think it's important to start all of your database projects in a locked mode to get the experience of setting up security rules. While your Firestore database is being created, you can jump over to the GitHub repo. I'll put a link in the description, but all you have to do is search for lesson 10 under Ajon P LLC. Once you have that, go ahead and clone the lesson 10 repository down and rename it to lesson 11. This will provide us a good starting base. The lesson 10 left off with a material sidebar nav and routing that we're going to use to continue this lesson. For the next step, we need to add Firebase to this project. You can do this by using Firebase init. Then you'll want to select Firestore. We're not going to use any hosting at this point. We have other lessons that cover that. Once you've completed selecting the correct project for your directory, you can use the defaults for Firestore and Firestore indexes and make sure that the Firestore rules is in that locked mode that we talked about earlier. Now that we've set our project up to use Firebase, we need to initialize it with the correct API settings. You can find this by going to the project settings, the gear icon next to project overview, and copying the config that you'll need for Firebase. At this point, you can take that configuration file and we'll add it to our environments.ts. And I've also put it into the prod.ts here. You can separate your project into multiple different environments. We'll tie back into this later on in a different project setup where there's multiple hosting elements that get involved. But just know for now, if you have it in the environment.prod.ts, it will get copied out and served. If you're like me, I often forget all of the commands to do stuff, but I do remember how to get to it. So if you go out to angularfire 2, you can see that we need to install both @angular/fire as well as Firebase. If you do the npm-i, that is for install, you can start doing this installation, and it will also install all of the other npm modules that were required for this setup. You should see both Firebase and angularfire in your package.json when we get done. If you have any questions on npm, I do have a module out there that explains more in detail how to use npm. At this time, we need to start using the angularfire module within our project. So we need to import it into our project using angularfire module and then initialize app. We're going to use the environment file that we had already set up, and it will be environment.firebase is where our configuration lives. I wanted to quickly run back through how to remove the lesson 10 origin from your Git repo so you can start tracking any amount of changes yourself. If you start to try to add or commit to this environment, it won't allow you to because you don't own it directly. You can use git remote remove origin and remove that, and then you can go back and add the current one that you're working on. For example, we're using lesson 11, so I'm going to git remote add lesson 11. The nice part about using the lesson 10 is that you get all the git commits that were prior to this one, and we can add a new one using VS Code or the git command line. I like using VS Code because it's more visual and that's how I learned. So go ahead and type a commit message in, hit the check mark, and we're good to go. You can push it for the first time up to your new remote repository. Now we can take a look at that repository. You'll see the last commit in this was the adding Firestore that we just added. Next, we'll start to create our first service for Firestore. You can do ngg for generate and service and put it in the core services file. Like I said in the last lesson, that's where I like to keep every service so we just know where to get to it easily. After that, we're going to take a look at setting up our initial Firestore layout, and that'll include both books, chapters within books, sections within those chapters, and that's how our model will traverse when we're doing the navigation. So essentially, you're adding a collection for every sub-object that you want in it. And what we should have is what looks like on this graph here is books containing chapter collections containing section collections. Now, if you want to stick strictly with the angularfire Firestore objects, you could use it just like this. And I'm going to fly through this because we actually are going to end up using angularfirebase's service that's created by Jeff a little later in the tutorial. So we'll update the firestore.service. This is the correct way of doing this in Firestore. I just think that Jeff has provided an easy to follow module to do all of the collection and document observables. So I'll show you where it starts kind of with the base here, and then we'll upgrade this service to use the Angular Firestore service. Now that we're all connected up to Firebase Firestore and we have a service ready to use, we're going to go through creating the components that will be required for the tree. So the first step is ngg again for generate, m for module, and we're going to create in modules books, the book tree. So after that command completes, do both the module and the component, we'll have our structure to continue forward with the tree component. What we want to do inside of the tree component is use a little dependency injection here and include the Firestore service directly into the tree component. We will also get the books. We'll also take this time to set up another module for booklist. This will list out all of the books and be able to use the router to navigate into them instead of just bringing up a book detail screen right away. So again, nggm for the module for booklist and C for the component. Inside of the book list, we're actually going to go out to Firestore and connect to the books collection so that we can pull in all of the books that are listed currently. And that way we have a way to navigate from books to chapters to sections. It's important for me to tell you at this point that I'm pretty terrible when it comes to TypeScript, but I can show you a little bit. So when we want to generate an interface to use in all of our components, we can do ngg interface, and then we'll put that in our core models and then name it book so that we can start to pass around the book interface so that we have all the typings from Firestore throughout our applications. You'll notice here that we added it to observable books so that we know everything about books coming in. However, in our service, we also need to update this observable to book when we pass it back. This will destructure the Firestore collection call so that it knows to put title into title. Honestly, it's just a reference, so you could technically pass any amount of attributes back in the Firestore collection call, but this will make it easier inside of our TypeScript files when we're trying to look for different properties within each object. Where this becomes very valuable, for instance, is this book list. I named it as an observable of book, but in reality, it's an array of books. And because we're passing the array of books outside of the getbooks method, we now see that we have a mismatch, and TypeScript is telling us that, so we can update correctly. Because I forgot to add the -- routing to the generation of our current module that we're working on, book-list, I forgot to get the routing. So we're going to take and copy that from the detail routing out of book detail and just copy and paste it in. The only downfall of doing this is that you need to update a couple of the properties that sit within it, including the class name and some of the routes. We're doing this so that the book router itself will go directly to the book list routing and then just include the book list component that we've created. Since we've changed the routing, let's take a look at the ng space s that will serve our current project. It'll open up to the kitchen sink because that is our defaulted item when there's no path at the end of it. You can use the menu to route to books, which will bring us into the book list works section because it's displaying the books list. Now at this time, we're going to start updating our Firestore service with a new service called angularfire. And this is a service provided by Jeff Delaney out on angularfirebase.com. It's kind of a wrapper service that uses the base Firestore service, but adds a lot more functionality to it. If you don't want to take the time to write this all by hand, I don't blame you. You can either pull down lesson 11 with this service already in it, or go check out angularfirebase.com. As you can see here, we're going to start changing our calls from FS, which was the Firestore service, to AFB, which is our Angular Firebase service. It has some very cool methods on it that delivers back observables. You could write all of these yourself by hand, but it's kind of pre-canned, and I'm hoping Jeff releases this as an NPM module, like I said. So now we can say things like this.afb collection with IDs, and that's going to return an observable that, of course, for us becomes our book array observable. If you happen to get any errors at this time, it's probably because you're missing the Angular storage module. Just go to app.module and import the Angular Fire storage module. I've used this in kind of a commented out section in the service that we just added, and we don't want that to continue blowing up. We'll use the storage later on when we start uploading photos to our books. We're going to start by adding material list navigation within our book list, so make sure you import that into your book list module, as well as the router module. Now that we have our material nav list, we can add all of our books that we have in our books collection to the screen one at a time, and they will correctly route because we're going to place the ID that's coming back from Firebase as an additional parameter that will route to the detail for that specific book. If you start to get an error on the book ID, make sure that you go back in and update our interface called book and add the ID as an optional parameter by adding question mark. And this is what's going to be passed through the router link. So when you click on each one, it should open up the detail for the individual books. Notice in the URL bar that the parameter for the book ID is actually listing out, even though the content is just saying detail at this time. I know everybody's probably pretty tired at this point. It's a long lesson, so if you want to take a little break, take a snooze like AJ is doing, that's cool. Do a git commit and push pause. The tree part of this lesson is coming up next. At this point, we're going to take the book drawer works section, which is in the book drawer module, and we're going to take and remove that and replace it by the book tree component. So first things first, we need to use the selector from the book tree component and use that as our HTML inside of the book drawer component HTML. This provides a location for our book tree to show up within the book drawer. We also need to make sure that we are going to import the book tree into our book drawer module by going to the book drawer module imports and adding the module. Inside of the book tree component module, we need to export the book tree component. Now that we have that set up, you can open up the browser again, and when you navigate to each of the books, you'll see that the book tree works appears in the book drawer. Now we're going to replace the default text with a material tree. I took this code directly from material.angular.io's examples with the one that says tree with dynamic data. Because this module is now going to use the material tree module, the material icon module, and the material progress bar module, we need to import all of those into the book tree module so that Angular understands that we're going to be using them within the component. The main component that is used is the book tree component. This is kind of the connection to our display. And what comes into this are a few additional classes that we've written above that. One being dynamic flat node. This will tell us a few different things about the node that we're using, whether it's expandable, you can load. We'll also add a lot of data to this as we progress through the file. The next thing we need to do is get the book ID from the parameter on Angular's router. So we can subscribe to that using this.route.parammap.subscribe, and it will produce any of the parameters that we're after. You'll notice that we pass the book ID into the getbook chapters. If you want to add this pipe tap, you can actually console log what we're getting back. Let's dive into the service now for our Angular Firebase. You notice inside of the service we have getbook chapters, which is passed in a book ID. We'll use that to get the collections for the chapter. The nice thing about having our Angular Firebase service is that it'll provide a wrapper that brings back the chapter IDs correctly. What we're doing here is setting up the initial values for our tree. So we'll add this to our dynamic node at level 0, and we'll add the chapter title so we have something to select. At this point, you should be able to see the tree out on the screen with buttons beside it. You've probably noticed that our buttons look a little funny and they're the default buttons for the browser. We most likely have forgot to import the material button in the book tree module, so let's do that now and see what it refreshes to look like. Anytime you see this weird sort of button behavior or anything else that should be a material look and feel, you need to import the correct modules into the current component you're working on. Now that we have the books set up correctly for our nodes, the chapter definition should be there as well as the section definition. If you don't have that set up yet, it is still just the NGG interface, and then you can do core modules, chapter and section to get those set up. We'll probably need title, description, and ID in each of those. We could also do the ID in books as an update. Now that we have the book and the chapters within the book, we need to set up the toggle such that the sections come back. We have that already defined in our Firebase Firestore database. We need to go after that using the same way we did with books and with the chapters. At this point, you might be wondering, how do we get that book ID? Well, up above, we didn't assign the book data to our node dynamic node module yet, so we're going to do that at this time. After that, we can send in the book ID and the chapter ID of the node that we're opening or toggling. We can then take and steal the chapter update code and place that into the sections code. We'll just need to update a few of the variable names so that they work correctly, along with placing the section object into the dynamic node that we're adding. If you've seen this error before or are getting it now, this is because we haven't set up our rules correctly yet. So we're going to need to update for both chapters and sections our Firestore rules, and this way it'll allow us to access our Firestore database at all of these different sections just by stating that we have read access to everyone. After you've updated the rules, we need to deploy them to Firebase. Using the Firebase CLI, just do firebase deploy -- only Firestore : rules, and this will update the backend. Once this is complete, we can run the site again, and you should see that the sections are now deploying correctly and you don't get an error message in the console. A very important part of the toggle node function is that we update the query parameters once this chapter has been opened. So we can set the chapter ID and the section ID in the URL query parameters. What this will allow us to do is in our detail, we can pick up on those new parameters dynamically and display the correct data to the screen. So if we take a look at our book detail, we're going to add an ng-on init, which is the first part of the component loading, is this new param subscribe for query parameters, as well as a param subscribe for book ID. So that way we'll know which book ID we want detail for, as well as what chapter that we might be looking at. In our book detail component.html, we'll create a new card so that we can display specific data for our book, and then we'll fetch that data based on the query parameters that we're going out to select. I'll speed through this pretty quickly. You can check out the GitHub repo to look at the full source code. You can see back in the component.ts file, when we're looking for the query parameters, we're subscribing to them all the time while this is active. So we need to check and make sure that the book ID and chapter ID have been filled out before we go fetching a book for the observable. This is true for both the book chapter and the book section. Once we have those data points, we'll actually assign them to our global parameter that has the chapter observable and section observable. We'll then take those into the HTML side and add a material card for both of them and only show them once the observable has been filled. The correct way of doing this in Angular is using the async keyword. What this allows for is the observable not to have to be subscribed to until there is data that is active. So you don't have to do any subscribing and unsubscribing in your .ts files. Once this is all complete, you should be able to drop down on the chapter selection and get a section menu, and every time you click on this section, it will update based on the observable going out to Firestore. Next up, we're going to change over our book list into an expansion panel that will include books, graphic novels, and authors. First thing we're going to do in book list component is add a expansion panel with the accordion style. We'll have to import both the accordion and toolbar into our book list module in order to get these to show correctly. Now that we see an expansion panel on our screen, we need to add a couple more headers for our expansion panel that'll include graphic novels and authors, and then we'll populate this within our Firestore database so that there's data coming back. We can do this by copying and pasting the expansion panel that already exists for our books and just renaming those to the correct router links that we will eventually use, probably not in this lesson, but further in the tutorial. So you can at this time add both the graphic novel as well as the author sections. Let's jump out to Firebase Firestore and include the new collections, graphic novels, and we can place a title inside of that for a single document and add as many documents as you'd like to list out in our graphic novels list. And then also add the authors collection and add a author with a name, any names you want there as well. If we jump back to the code, you can see that it's looping through on the books list at a book list with a async pipe. We need to copy that into each of our expansion panels so that we have values to navigate against when the novels and the authors come back from our service. We know that the getbooks method was called from our service so that we could populate our observable for the books. We need to copy this and create both the graphic novel as well as the author from the Firebase Firestore collection that we just added. This observable then needs to be updated in our component so that we have the list observables for each of these connected correctly. If we're using TypeScript the way we should be, we should also define interfaces for both the author as well as the graphic novel. If we take a look at the example at this point, we're probably going to get an error because we're still in that locked mode, which is perfect because now we can update our Firestore rules just at the paths that we want. So we'll be at the same level as books, and we need to update for both our authors as well as the graphic novels, and then we're going to deploy that again to Firestore. If you check out the Firestore rules tab, you should see both our authors and graphic novels now. You'll probably see an error if you try the drop-down expansion list at this point, because we've associated the router links that aren't really router links yet. So if we clean up this file, we can remove everything from the router link for the bottom two, as we're not going to implement those in this lesson. And this will allow us to then see that we have both the graphic novels values as well as the author values. I know this is a long lesson, so if you have any questions, go to agenp.com and join our Slack channel. Out there, we have tons of material as well as a good community that is bouncing questions back and forth.